Disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this publication are those of the authors. They do not purport to reflect the opinions or views of Paddle and Fin or its members. The designations employed in this publication and the presentation of materials therein do not imply the expression of any opinion whatsoever on the part of Paddle and Fin concerning the legal status of any country, area, or territory, or of its authorities, or concerning the delimitation of its frontiers.
What is going on, boys and girls? Welcome to once again to the Bass Kayak and Beers podcast. As always, it's your boy Armando. Today's episode, it's gonna be an interesting episode. I mean, I figured at some point when I decided that I was gonna start doing a podcast, this sort of episode would come up. And there's a lot that I have to say. And let me start by saying I'm going to be talking about the recent controversy regarding the Pickwick Bass Nation Kayak Series. So if you don't know, the last event of the Bass Nation Kayak Series at Lake Pickwick, Drew Gregory won that tournament. With that win, he also secured Angler of the Year. So there's a lot riding on this tournament, not just the tournament winnings, but also possible or potential sponsorship that comes with Angler of the Year and other prizes. That result by Drew Gregory has been contested or protested. The protest has been accepted by Bass Nation Kayak Series by the tournament directors. And Drew Gregory is appealing that, or I should say, Drew Gregory has been advised of that and has given a chance to present his side of things. So at the moment, there is not an official at this point of the recording, which is today is Monday, October 17th in the morning. At this point, there has been no decision because it is under review. The protest has been submitted by 10 different anglers, and that is a significant number. And towards the end of this episode, I'll talk a little bit about why that's significant. So stick around because you might want to listen to that. I want to set a few things straight before I start talking about this. And first of all, I didn't just wake up this morning and decided that I wanted to talk about this. I've taken the last 7 days to interview and talk to more than a dozen people regarding this and the interpretation of the rules and what actually happened. Among the people that I've talked, I'm not going to name names because it's a private conversation, but I've talked to tournament directors. I talked to a few of the people that actually protested it. I've talked to the people that, or some of the people that actually presented evidence of this, and we'll talk about the evidence in a bit. I've talked to Drew Gregory himself. Drew Gregory was invited for this podcast, but however, because of the protest being accepted and being under review, he doesn't want to come into any podcast until this is done, which I respect. I don't think he's purposely trying to avoid this. He's just going to wait till everything comes out, and that's his right. I would have loved to have him on the podcast to talk about this, but he declined, and I respect his decision. I think it's okay. I don't feel like he's trying to avoid this at all. It's just pausing it until things get clarified with Bass Nation Kayak Series and the tournament directors. I say this that I've talked to these people, but like I said, I didn't just wake up and decide to talk about it. I've done my research. I've done my homework. I feel comfortable now that I've gathered all, if not most of the facts regarding this, to make an informal, formal, an educational podcast on what's going on. There's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformations from conversations that I've had with different people. Some of you of my listeners have actually called me and texted me and contacted me through social media regarding this once the story kind of broke out after last week's episode with KBN, where it kind of like, that's when it kind of came out. And that's where I think a lot of this got how do you say this, kind of churned up um, to the surface. I don't think a lot of people knew about what was going on until this came up, or that episode aired. Um, so again, I've done my research on this. I feel comfortable. I'm not just giving personal opinions without fact checking some of this. There's a lot of misinformation from what I see talking to some of the people that have contacted me about what rule was broken, and a bunch of comments I'm seeing on social media about gray rules, misinterpretation, and I think it's important to educate ourselves on what the rules are and what was protest. So we need to identify what it is and what it's not. Um, Another thing that I want to mention is I would have rather much be doing this podcast if it was somebody else's other than Drew Gregory. If you've listened to my podcast before, if you listen to my episodes about with Drew Gregory, if you've seen my social media, you know I'm a huge fan of Drew Gregory. I've declared him the GOAT based on the what he's done consistently throughout the years. Um, and Drew Gregory has done more for the growth of the kayak fishing community than most. Um, you know, he's done so many. He's been a great ambassador to the kayak bass fishing community. He is a world class, not just angler but paddler. Um, he is, by all accounts, a great human being. I personally have a lot of respect for Drew Gregory. However, I have to be objective when I'm going to do this episode. Some of the things that Drew Gregory has mentioned, I personally don't agree with. I think some of it need to be fact checked, but it's not me picking on Drew Gregory or attacking Drew Gregory at all. I have nothing but the utmost respect for Drew Gregory, and I think he's earned the benefit of the doubt in the court of public opinions. When it comes to tournament rules are tournament rules. Nobody's above the rules. Nobody's above the law. If Drew Gregory or anybody else breaks a rule, knowingly or unknowingly, that person's result should be disqualified. This is nothing personal on Drew. However, like I said, in the court of personal opinion, I think Drew Gregory deserves and has earned benefit of the doubt. Personally, Drew Gregory, and I'll tell this story because, again, I want to highlight how much I respect and appreciate Drew Gregory. On Lake Darnell, the tournament that I took part for the Hobie BOS last month, the couple of days before I head out to the tournament, I witnessed a close friend of mine um, be the victim of some disturbing behavior by other people. And that really put me in a really, really dark place. Um, when I went out driving to Lake Darnell on Wednesday in my first hour, I just wanted to come back and stay home. I didn't, fishing was the last thing on my mind. And I needed to kind of recalibrate and uh, mentally and get out of this, dark cloud that was just hovering over my emotions. I contacted Duke Gregory. He was driving from his home to Lake Darnell as well, and I told him, "Hey, listen, I'm in a dark place right now. I can't focus on anything. I just want somebody to talk to while I'm driving about fishing and kind of maybe get me back on focus on the trail." And we did. We had a great conversation, and I am super grateful for Drew Gregory about that. That's the kind of person that Drew. He didn't ask me what I was going through. He was just like, "Let's do it. Let's talk fishing, man. What do you want to talk about? And we talked, and we had a great conversation. I say that because I'm very grateful for Drew. Once in Lake Darnell, thanks to Drew, I got to meet Fred Rambonis and his son Jackson, who ended up winning the tournament. I am super grateful for the connections that I made through kayak fishing through Drew Gregory, and I appreciate him. I have nothing but the utmost respect for him. But like I said, I will be talking about some of the talking points that I don't agree with Drew Gregory, but that doesn't mean that I don't still view him as a friend, as a close friend, as somebody that I admire. I do not question his kayak fishing skills. I do not question his integrity as a person. Let me make that very clear. Before we start actually talking about this, just a quick shout out to my sponsor, Douglas Rod. Go to douglasoutdoors.com. Check out their full lineup of LRS, X Matrix, and award winning fly fishing rods. We're going to go to a quick waypoints commercial, and then we'll begin talking about the tournament. So, like I mentioned, Drew Gregory's results has been contested, and it's not just the tournament winnings and the first place that is at stake. Would be also the Angler of the Year, which would now pretty much end his run for Angler of the Year. Let's talk about what was challenged and clear up the misconception of what it is that it was protested. And to explain to you that maybe if you're not familiar with how this works, when an angler is protesting the results for another tournament angler, he has to identify what he's protesting. Like, what are the actions that he's protesting? And from there, they single out what is the rule that was broken. Okay? Every other rule doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the rule that was in question or the rule that was broken. I say this because I think in this whole conversation, there seems to be this stigma that the rules are not clear, that there is that it is free for interpretation, and that it is confusing. And although I think some rules regarding bass fishing, not just Bass Nation, but Hobie BOS, should be cleaned up in regards to the rule in question, to the action being protest. Let me make this very, very clear. There is no gray area. There is no confusion. There is no, well, what if he interpreted differently? There is not. And we're going to go over that. Before go over that, let's read the rules that govern this body of water. And for those that are not familiar with national tournament fishing, so there is the rules that you find on the website. That's just the general rules about hand placement, bodies of waters, launch axes. The only thing that you need to know about this in the general rules is that it says that you're not allowed to portage. In other words, you're not allowed to go over an obstacle, over land, over a beaver dam, over a shallow laydown, over whatever, without, you're not allowed to go through it while getting out of your kayak. In other words, you have to be able to navigate through whatever obstacle there is without getting out of your kayak in order to continue fishing that body of water. That's what the general rule says on the website. Then every tournament has the rules that govern that specific body of water, and that pertains more to boundaries. So we're not going to read all the rules for the overall rules that is on the website. We're going to focus on the rules for Lake Pickwick because therein lies the protest. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Let's see, share screen. Chrome tab. Okay, so Pickwick, I hope you can see this. I'm going to read this. So again, this is the additional information. This goes over top of the general rules. Tournament waters, Pickwick Lake, and any creek and canals connecting to Pickwick Lake. So what it's saying is everything that's connected to Pickwick Lake is eligible waters. Next sentence shows the limitation of that. It says, for example, Wilson Dam to Pickwick Dam, no locking. You may not go to South Highway 25 Bridge in Yellow Creek. Bay Springs Lake is outside of the tournament boundaries. And this is very important. Only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick will be considered accessible. This is very important. This is where the rule that is being in question, or this is where the protest lie. The protest says that the person in question fished waters that were not accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake. I've talked to a dozen anglers, more than a dozen anglers, since this story broke out, and asked them what do they interpret as only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered accessible. I've talked to anglers that are tournament directors, former tournament directors, people that put in the protest, anglers that put in the protest, anglers that are really close friends with Drew Gregory. I've talked to Drew Gregory himself. And no, there is not a single person out there that has misinterpreted this rule. Everybody understands that that means that if you cannot access the body of water that you want to go up to without having to get out of your kayak, then that means it's not accessible. Every single person understands this rule. And even if there is one person that doesn't understand this rule, I guarantee you, because I've talked to Drew Gregory himself understands this rule. There is no gray area. There is no free to interpretation this rule. Not by me, not by Jeff Malott, not by Ryan Lambert, not by anybody else, not by Drew Gregory. It says what it says. Only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick will be considered accessible waters. So just because it says on the beginning of the paragraph, Pickwick Lake and any creeks and canals connecting to Pickwick Lake, doesn't mean that you can fish any part of the creeks or canals. It means that you can go up those creeks and canals as long as the water is accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake. And again, I reiterate, Drew Gregory knows this rule. And I'm not picking on Drew Gregory, but I can tell you, and I've talked to Drew Gregory, he understands this rule as well as anybody else. Drew Gregory himself has been the subject of protests in the past. Over the last 5 years or so, his tournament results have been contested more than half a dozen times. And on all of them, on most, if not all of them, it states that he was not fishing the main body, that the creek that he was fishing, or the body of water that he was fishing, was not accessible from the main body of lake, name of, or the main on the tournament waters. Sorry, got a little sidetracked there for a second. So this, not just this tournament, but in the past, over the course of like 5 or 6 years, Drew Gregory's has had protests against him because of this same thing. I've been on the record on my podcast and on social media of defending Drew simply because there wasn't any evidence that that rule was breaking. Nevertheless, I made this point. I'm saying this to make a point that Drew knows this rule because he himself has had to submit evidence to prove that the body of water that he was fishing was accessible from the main lake in past tournament, not in this tournament, in past tournaments. The point that I'm trying to make is that Drew knows this rule, and there is no misinterpretation of the rule. And that's very key, because a lot of people are going like, well, you can interpret the rules one way or the other. I don't see how you can interpret this specific rule any other way. But even if you did, let's rest assured, Drew Gregory doesn't misinterpret it for the reasons that I've just stated. Now that we got that clear, let's talk about how did this came about and why is that rule being protested? Did Drew Gregory fish bodies of waters that were not accessible to the main lake? I've talked to, like I said, a dozen people over the last week. I've talked to people that submitted evidence of this. I've talked to people that protested this Pickwick event. And from the evidence that was shown to me, and there was photos and video recordings of this, I can only say I can only get to the conclusion that yes, Drew Gregory was not fishing body of water that was accessible from the main lake. And I can comfortably declare that because I've seen the evidence of it. And we'll talk about the evidence in just a second. But before we get to that, how did this came about? This comes about because Drew Gregory submitted a fish that is an Alabama strain bass. And this part, I am not a marine biologist. I cannot tell the difference between an Alabama bass and a tip and any other bass. I can tell you the difference between a largemouth bass and a smallmouth bass. I can tell you the difference between a spotted bass and a largemouth bass, but that's as far as my knowledge of bass subfish species goes. Okay, but nevertheless, this came about because somebody noticed, or a few people noticed, that one of the bass that he had submitted was an Alabama strain bass. Why is that relevant? That's relevant because, from what I've been told, there is no record of an Alabama strain bass, and I could be misrepresenting the species, whatever species it was. I don't know the Latin name for it, whatever. Um, the point is, this subspecies of bass that he caught is not found or has never been recorded on Lake Pickwick, and that raised the flag with more than one tournament angler. So when they see that, they go to the tournament organizer and says, this is not possible because this type of bass does not exist on Pickwick Lake. So we need to know where he was fishing. There needs to be, like Drew says, and Drew's okay with it because he said on social media, checks and balances for this. So tournament director then kind of points out where the metadata was from. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, basically when you submit a fish on TourneyX, it has the metadata. In other words, it has the GPS coordinates and it can pinpoint where you caught that fish and at what time you caught that fish according to where the fish, the photo was taken. That information is uploaded along with the picture. So when this tournament anglers that are protesting the results go up to the tournament directors or organizers and say, we need to know where he caught this bass because this bass is not this subspecies of bass is not in Lake Pickwick. They noticed that Drew Gregory was fishing at a creek that feeds into Lake Pickwick, and it was approximately 20 miles away from Lake Pickwick or the body of water. That is a pretty big number. And although the rules don't say how far up a creek you can go, that is not what is in question here. What is in question again is whether or not Drew Gregory was fishing on bodies of water that were accessible from the main lake. So when they look at that, they look at Google Maps and they look at other satellite images and realize there is a bunch of laydowns and a bunch of obstructions that would stop you, would not allow you to go to that part of the lake from the main body of lake without having the need to portage. Obviously, Google image can change because that picture might have been taken 2 or 3 from a satellite picture, must have been taken 2 or 3 years ago, and that could have changed. That laydown may not be there, or the body or the water level may be higher and therefore easier to navigate. So what these tournaments anglers did, they packed up, went to where the metadata shows Drew Gregory caught that fish and other fish, and they documented the journey trying to go from that specific area where the fish was caught to the main body of water. And I've corroborated this story with one of the persons that contested the rule and submitted the evidence. I personally have seen the evidence, and there's photos and there's videos of it. I'm not going to share the photos video because they're not mine. You can find them on social media. But what I saw was just trunks of like on laydowns that go like 3 or 4 feet above the water. And from what I've been told, there were multiple sections like that that are just impossible. I don't care how good of a paddler you is. And keep in mind, Drew Gregory is a world-class paddler. Every tournament there is, the best paddler out there, my money is that Drew Gregory is the best paddler out there. World-class paddler. He's been doing this for 10 years, which also highlights why I say that he knows the rules in questions, and there is no confusion. He himself was the tournament director or the founder of River Bassing. So he himself has been the tournament director, and he's been doing tournaments for the better part of the decade. So he completely knows all the rules. And again, I'm not picking on Drew Gregory. I love Drew Gregory and respect, and I hope to have his friendship after this podcast. And I'm confident, Drew being the class act person that he is, that we're still going to be friends about it. But the fact remains, that this rule was broken according to the evidence that I've seen. And again, Bass Nation has accepted the protest, and Drew Gregory is now submitted or pleaded his case, and it's under review. This again, it was video submitted, and there was not just one, but from what I understand, more than half a dozen places where the water was obstructed. The fact that it was 20 miles away from the actual tournament waters sends a red flag. And again, there is no rule that says how far up the creek you can go. But like if you read the rules again, it does say you may not go up south of Highway 25 Bridge, Yellow Creek. Bay Springs Lake is outside tournament waters. And it does say only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered accessible. Or even though it doesn't give a number, that's irrelevant. The rule that is protested, or the action that it protests, pertains to the rule that says the body of water must be accessible from the main lake. And that is very important, regardless of how you feel about accessible waters, portaging rules. None of that comes into place. Drew Gregory has been on social media saying that he didn't portage and that he access public bodies of water. And I'll tell you right now, I completely believe Drew Gregory when he says he access public bodies of water. I'll put a gun to my head and say that is completely accurate when he says he access through a public area. I completely believe him, and I'll take this to the grave. I'll completely believe him when he says he did not portage at any time. I completely believe him. The problem is that's not the rule that he's allegedly broke. I keep hearing people talking in social media about, and I respect everybody's opinion about, well, we need to define tournament waters, we need to define public areas, we need to define portaging. That's fine and dandy, but that's not the rule that is being broken. The rule that is being broken again, and I'll cite it again, only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered accessible. So regardless if Drew Gregory launched from a public access, which I guarantee you he did, regardless of the fact that he abided by the portaging rules and did not portage, I'm here to tell you I completely believe him. I'll put I bet my life on that he's telling the truth. That is not what it is in question. Just because you access from a public lake and just because you didn't portage, that doesn't mean that you followed the third rule, which is it must be accessible from the main body of lake. This is like me saying, and I'll try to illustrate, this is like me stopping at a red light for 3 seconds and then running the red light. And then having a cop give me a ticket and challenge. He says, well, why stop at the red light? I stopped for 3 seconds. Yes, I did stop. I did follow the rules in that aspect. I did stop at the red light, but then I ran the red light because I continued after I stopped without waiting it to get green. That's what I'm trying to illustrate. So, in other words, Drew Gregory did follow the rules about portaging and about public access, but that is irrelevant because the body of water was he was fishing was not accessible from the main lake. And again, Drew Gregory cannot go out here and say he misinterpreted that rule. And he, to my knowledge, he hasn't said that he misinterpreted the rule. From what I've seen on the social media and from what the podcast that I heard with KBN, he hasn't said, "Oh, I misinterpreted that rule." I'm sorry. I'm not saying that he has. All I'm saying is that he can't say that he misinterpreted the rule because again, this is a rule that he's been contested for at least half a dozen times in the last 5 or 6 years. So he knows this rule better than you and me. He's completely aware of this rule, and he's completely aware that he's been contested about it. And he himself has submitted videos of him going up shoalies to prove that the water where he was fishing was accessible from the main lake. That we're not talking about Lake Pickwick, we're talking about past tournaments. Now, I've defended Drew Gregory even on Lake Darnell this past month for the Hobie BOS. People know that I've, hyped up Drew Gregory on my podcast and my social media, and I actually had somebody call me out on Lake Darnell at the boat wrap and says, this is what the person says. You know that your boy Drew Gregory is cheating on this tournament, and I asked him, what do you mean by that, and what evidence you have? It's like, oh, I saw him fishing in legal waters. I'm like, do you have proof of that? No, I don't have proof, but I know what I saw. I was like, if you don't have proof of that, I'm not going to take your side. You can say whatever you want, but unless you submit evidence of him doing that, I can't just believe you. I'll ask Drew Gregory, and I did. I asked Drew Gregory about it. So I'm going to side with Drew Gregory because he's earned that right. Now, I've asked why in the previous half a dozen times that he's been protested, why that protest hasn't been accepted, or why was he never disqualified? And it comes down to lack of evidence. And again, some of the people that actually protested this tournament in the past have defended Drew publicly and privately on past protests regarding this same rule regarding Drew Gregory. So I don't think this is anybody just having a personal vendetta against Drew Gregory. The fact that 10 people submitted it is a significant number. Sorry about that. Let me just take a sip to dry my lips there. That feels good. So the fact of the matter is, again, this is not tournament waters. And I've defended Drew, and I've been called out on it. And people have messaged me, have called me regarding this when this story comes out. And I will continue to defend Drew in the past. But in this case, a way that I see it, and the evidence that presented to me clearly states that Drew Gregory was out of bounds and therefore should be disqualified. I love Drew Gregory, but not everybody is above the law. My podcast will always side with the truth. My only loyalty with my podcast is to the facts, the truth, and the kayak fishing community and my listeners. I don't come on this podcast to talk about controversial stuff just to get listeners. If you follow me on my podcast and you follow me on social media, you know that at no point have I addressed the scandal in the walleye fishing world that took place. Because guess what? It has nothing to do with kayak fishing. And I'm not here for the clickbaits and the sound bites. I'm here to grow organically and serve the kayak fishing community and do whatever it is best for the kayak fishing community. Same thing with Keith Boucher and whatever happened in Bass Nation Kayak Bassmaster events and Bass Opens. I've even talked about it on social media. I haven't talked about it on my podcast because it is not relevant. I'm not here for the sound bites. I'm not here for the clickbaits. Much as I love Drew Gregory, I cannot side with something that's wrong. Now, I do side with Drew Gregory in the sense that I don't think he did this on purpose. It's up to everybody's opinion. How did he, as somebody from this much experience, screw up on this and fish this 20 miles away without checking? I can't explain it. That's up to Drew to explain it. But if Drew says that that is his mistake and that he should have checked, then I agree with him. If he said that he thought it was that he thought the water was accessible from the main lake, I believe him. But that's just in the court of public opinion. The fact remains that it was not, and therefore he should be disqualified. And again, that's nothing personal on Drew. I've had Drew on this podcast before. I've glown about what an amazing angler. I don't question his ability at all. But again, there is a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformations, and a lot of it from talking to some of my listeners that called me and kind of like wanted me to address this or wanted my opinion on this. It seems that it stems a lot with what happened on the KBN podcast. And if you haven't listened to it, it was last week's episode on the KBN when they had Drew Gregory. My thoughts on that podcast, I don't think Jeff Ballard and Ryan Lambert were out there to try to corner Drew Gregory. I think this conversation just kind of evolved. And I want to play some of the soundbite and fact check what Drew Gregory said. Now, let me start by saying this. I think if you listen to the whole podcast and you're going to listen on the sound clip, there seemed to be a disconnect on what Jeff Ballard and Ryan Lambert were trying to say and what Drew Gregory is trying to say. So I really think that what Drew Gregory said was not in the context, and therefore it came out confusing to some people. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. And as you can see in the soundbite, there did seem like there was confusion between what each one was trying to point out. But nevertheless, Drew mentioned some things that are not factual. And I think it's important to clear that up. And again, nothing against Drew. So let's see if I can share that screen again. Share screen, Chrome tab. All right, let's go through this. I'm not going to go through the whole episode. I'm just going to go through the parts that are relevant to this. And it's only going to be like a minute. And then I'll play it out and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way the rules right now, it's pretty clear. All creeks connected to Pickwick Lake. I don't know what's not clear about that. It says all creeks and rivers that are connected. So if people don't understand that, then I don't know what to say, man. But it's pretty clear as far as that goes. But as far as
okay, let me stop it right there, because again, Drew is quoting part of the rules, and I'm not accusing Drew of lying, but whether it was on purpose or not on purpose, the fact remains that he's omitting part half of the rule, which honestly it favors his position on this. By omitting this other information, it makes it seem like he's completely right. And I say I'm not accusing Drew Gregory of this. Like you'll see next, there seemed to be a misunderstanding of what Drew Gregory is trying to say and what Jeff Ballard wants to say. But nevertheless, Drew Gregory is what he's saying. It's like all creeks and canals that are connected are eligible tournament waters. And again, I go back to the rule book. The rule book says that it needs to be accessible from the main body of lake. And again, he left out that information, and that information is what is in question here. That's the rule that he allegedly broke. So let's continue listening to this.
What you were saying on the, going over dry land. Well, if you're going over dry land to something that's a pond, well, that's obviously that water's not connected anymore. It's a man-made. That's why the word man-made is important to have in there. Man-made dam or berm or whatever you can't get through. You know what I mean? A pipe or whatever.
Ryan,
but if it's just it's just But I mean, it's pretty clear that if the water's connected, it's part of that lake because the water is all connected. It's not separated by a man-made, a whole new ecosystem, a farm pond. It's connected. It's free flowing is the word. It's all the little fingers and arms, kind of like we talked about with. So what
if there's
Okay, let me pause it right there. Because again, Drew Gregory, I'm not saying he's doing it on purpose, but he's saying, well, if the water is connected, that's irrelevant. And again, if you're going to cite that rule, you need to cite the rule also that says, and I'll read it again, only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered accessible. So yes, the rule says Pickwick Lake and any creeks and canals connecting to Pickwick Lake, but only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered accessible. And again, stating one half of the rule that is convenient to you, and I'm not saying he's doing it on purpose, but just stating that part of the first part of the rule where it says lakes and creeks, canals connecting to Pickwick Lake doesn't make it right, because you're omitting the part where it says only waters accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered. And this is where it needs to be clarified, because a lot of people are getting hung up on this, to saying like, well, the water is connected, so it's accessible. No, it clearly states only accessible from the main body of Pickwick Lake will be considered accessible. And it doesn't make a distinction whether it's man-made accessible or nature-made accessible or inaccessible. It just says that it needs to be accessible. So if you're going to quote that rule, you need to quote it completely. You just can't cherry pick one part of the rule to clear yourself of the second part of the rule. That makes sense. Let's continue. And by the way, keep an eye on Ryan Lambert on this, because I think it's hilarious how Ryan Lambert is trying to keep it together, because he is clearly frustrated at the miscommunication that's going on here. And it's pretty funny.
Obstruction in between the lake and maybe 20 or 30 miles up a creek that you're fishing. How do you know if that obstruction's there?
What do you mean? How do you know if it's there?
And that's why I defend Drew, in the sense that I think he just didn't understand what the context of the conversation was.
There's a tree down. If the water's dropped and now there's a shoal that's 10 miles down the creek from you, that's now an obstruction that doesn't connect to the lake anymore.
I'll tell you, the rules say
Drew's getting frustrated here.
All rivers and creeks flowing into Lake Pickwick and must be public access. So
Okay, so again, Drew Gregory is misquoting the rules here. And again, I'm not accusing Drew Gregory of doing this on purpose. I genuinely believe that he believes that. But what he's saying right now is he's kind of changing the narrative here. And I'm not saying he's on purpose. Like I said, you can notice that he's just not understanding what Jeff Malott and Lunch Money, Ryan Lambert, is trying to say. What he's saying right now is like, well, if it's accessible from public areas and it's a channel or a creek that feeds into Lake Pickwick, then it is okay. And that is not true. Or again, that is a misrepresentation of the rule. That is taking now a part of the rule that says it must be accessible from the water. So basically, there's another rule that says that you need to access the body of water through public access. That is one rule that's separate from this rule. That rule has nothing to do with eligible waters. That's just a different rule that deals with the accessible point. So he's saying basically that the creek is okay as long as it access on public water. And while that is true, again, he's omitting the rule, the part of the rule that says that it needs to be connected to the main body of water. Again, just because Drew Gregory access this body of water that's inaccessible from the main lake, even if he accessed it legally, meaning even if he accessed this part of the creek that is accessible from public lake, that doesn't mean that he can fish it, because if that portion that he fishes is not accessible through the main lake, regardless that he accessed legally or not, is still an off-limit part of the creek because it is not accessible from the main body of lake. So again, I do believe Drew Gregory accessed the body of water in question through public land, which is correct. He is right about that. But again, that part of the body of water that he was fishing was not accessible from the main lake, and that is the only thing that matters, because that is the only rule that's quoted in the protest. You can follow 99 out of 100 rules, but if you don't follow that one single rule, you're still disqualified. let me continue on a little
You
bit
access at public access and you go down and you hit that, and you don't, if you for some reason hit it, you can't go over it. You can't get out. You can't get out and go over it. You can't, according to the Bass rules, you can't get out and go over it. It's pretty clear. If you do find something like that, you can't get out and go over it. Your fishing is done. You go back the other direction.
Well,
That's all you gotta do.
the rules for bass
Yeah.
actually. I
Ryan
don't know
Lambert
if
is
you see
getting
it the
so
same way.
frustrated
The
here.
bass
It's
rules
so
say
funny.
all water must be accessible from the main lake.
Yeah.
So
Not-
if you're fishing above an
Exactly.
obstruction,
And
does
the-
that make it
right.
inaccessible from the main lake is the question. That's what I'm saying
Right.
with the gray area stuff. Like it's open
Yeah, they
to
could clear that up.
interpretation.
And this one, I don't agree with Lunch Money, Ryan Lambert on this. This is that can be cleared up. That doesn't need to be cleared up. It just says that it must be accessible from the main body of lake. I don't see where that needs to be cleared up. Everybody understands the rule. Jeff Malott quoted it, and Drew Gregory. Drew Gregory, when Jeff Malott said you must be accessible from the main lake, Drew Gregory says right. So he understands that rule. And again, this could be something that it seems to me like the context of what Jeff Malott and Ryan Lambert was talking about is not the same context as Drew Gregory, or what Drew Gregory thought what the context was. So there was a miscommunication there, and that's why I give Drew the benefit of the doubt in the sense that I don't think he was purposely misleading or purposely cherry picking rules to declare his innocence on this. But nevertheless, again, he is right in the sense that he did access the body of water through public land. He is right that he did not portage. He did not violate either of those rules, but he still broke the rule that says that body of water needs to be accessible from the main lake. There's no gray area on that. I'm sorry. I wish this was somebody else other than Gregory. And again, on the court of public opinions, I'll side with Drew Gregory that maybe for some reason, and I can't think of one, but for some reason he made a mistake and it wasn't on purpose. What I'm saying, I don't think he purposely tried to break the rules. But I can't just, but it's logical, or it's safe to say that he understands that rule. And that rule was broken. Again, so that's my point of view on it. I wanted to touch on something else, and I got so caught up with this that I completely forgot. But yeah, that's basically it. I promised you that I was going to talk about the significance of 10 anglers protesting this. And again, context is everything on this. Over the last, like I mentioned before, over the last 5 or 6 years, Drew Gregory has been finishes have been protested before and has not been accepted because there was lack of evidence. I've talked to different anglers that protested this tournament, and I've talked to anglers that have protested tournaments in the past, like Lake Darnell, I think like 3 years ago, and other past tournaments. I think Smith Lake this year on Bass Nation was also protested. And again, I'll defend Drew if there's no lack of evidence. From what I've asked people that protest is, and I get that, it's hard to protest when it's hard not, let me correct myself. It's not hard to protest. It's hard to provide evidence when you're fishing a tournament and then you find out that the person that was fishing waters as shown in the metadata was fishing waters that were outside the eligible waters because they weren't accessible from the main lake, because you're out there fishing. You're not out there policing anybody. You're just going out there concentrating, trying to get your 5 fish or your 10 fish if it's a 2-day tournament, right? So you're not going out there policing anybody. So once the tournament is done, everybody packs up and heads back to the house or the award ceremony, whatever it is. So it's not easy to catch somebody in the act of doing that. The reason why this was able, in this case, there was evidence submitted, is because fraction of those 10 anglers decided we're going to do something about it, and we're going to go and document the journey from where he caught the fish to the main body of lake. And again, I've seen the evidence, and I'm convinced that Drew Gregory needs to be disqualified. The significance of 10 anglers submitting is a message, not just to Bass Nation or Dwayne Wally, or it's a message to all national tournament directors. From what I've talked to people, there is this growing sentiment that tournament organization, national tournament organization, I'm not calling anyone out specifically, but the fact remains, I've talked to several tournament anglers that have expressed their frustration with the hands-off approach of this national trail directors organization, saying, I don't want to get involved in disqualifying anybody. Reasons that I can only suspect is they don't want that bad stigma or that dark cloud hanging over their product. A lot of the tournament anglers feel that the reason why this has escalated to this point is because tournament directors, again, have been quote unquote lazy or unwilling to enforce their own rules for fear of having this dark cloud hanging over the tournament. And I'm not calling anybody out specifically, but the fact remains that I've talked to more than a dozen anglers, and a lot of them feel that way. And this is a message. This is 10 people. You don't need 10 people to protest. For the most part, it's one person protesting this, and that's it. That's all you need to protest, as long as you have evidence. The fact that 10 people protested, they're sending a message to this tournament organization. Again, not just Bass Nation. If you don't get this right, you may not see us again. And I talked to some tournament anglers saying, if they don't get this right, I'm not coming back to this tournament or this trail. So this is very important. I mean, Bass Nation is trying to once again build up what they were trying to build. Over the last 2 seasons, the numbers have been declining. These numbers are not even close to what Hobie BOS and KBF numbers are pulling. And they want to grow this. They're making changes. John Stewart is not there anymore. There's going to be a new tournament director. They've had meetings with, I think, about 10 anglers, not related to the protest, but with a group of anglers to kind of go over what things they can do to grow their product. And this is a message. This is a coordinated message by these 10 anglers saying, you want to grow your product, you better do things right. You better start tightening up and being lazy about enforcing your rules and having this hands-off approach. And I've talked to several people. I've had people come and say, I'm not fishing any more national trails because, and I get it. If you're paying upwards to $800 or $1,000 to be in a tournament, and that's counting tournament fees, gas prices, groceries, Airbnbs. I mean, there are a few people that have sponsorship that kind of mitigate those costs, but for most of out there, I'm telling you right now, Lake Darnell to me is like $800 at least to fish. Any tournament outside of Texas, it's going to be with gas prices and Airbnbs and everything about $800. I just want a fair shot at landing in the money and win a tournament. And if people don't feel like that is being protected, they're going to stop going to these tournaments. And I guarantee you, if Bass Nation doesn't get this right, this could signal the decline that ultimately ends Bass Nation kayak season. And I'm not making empty threats. I'm just saying, according to what I've talked to some anglers, they fully expect Bass Nation to do the right thing. And what they feel the right thing is that this result is being disqualified. And again, nothing personal on Drew Gregory. I'll say this again. I love Drew Gregory. Drew Gregory is a close friend of mine. He still is past this podcast, and I hope he still views me this way. He's welcome to come in my podcast whenever he wins another tournament. I guarantee I'm going to invite him. Whenever I have other subjects related to kayak fishing that I think he would bring a great input, I would certainly reach out to him and have him on my podcast. I have nothing but the utmost respect. And in the court of public opinions, I give Drew Gregory the benefit of the doubt because I think he's earned it. But again, that's my thoughts on this. Later on in the year, I'll make an episode about what rules could be tightening up and what is more related to launch points and accessible points and all that. But that's going to be later in the episode. I don't want to mix one thing with the other because I think it's important for us to stay on point on this. I hope this clarifies any doubts that you may have on what's going on. If you don't like my opinion, please know that I respect your opinions. I hope you respect mine. If you have any thoughts on this, you can reach me at email, basskayakandbeers@gmail.com. You can reach me on social media, on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. So have a great day, everyone. If you're going to be on the water, please wear your PFDs. If you're having a couple of beers while you're on the water, please drink responsibly. Make sure you make it back to your loved ones. Have a good day, everyone. Peace out.